In 1982, two horror legends, George A. Romero and Stephen King, came together to create the classic Creepshow movie. With its 5 stories of fright, it made a name for itself, and it still stands up today as a good horror film. After all, how can anybody forget those practical effects from the 80s that made the monsters so creepy? And the tales were fairly enthralling too, each with their own way of scaring the audience. 5 years later, a sequel was released, and while not many people liked this one as much as its predecessor, or even remember it, it's still a decent film because, while it doesn't do all the right things that the first movie did, it still has intriguing stories, and the supernatural beings were cool too. Fast forward to 2006, and another Creepshow came out, but unlike the other 2 films, this one really fell flat on its face in terms of capturing the charm of the first 2 films that made them great, and just being a good film in general. There's also the TV series, but we'll get to that another time. So, what exactly made the first 2 films so eerie, but a good, entertaining watch, while the third one is boring and nowhere near as captivating as its predecessors? Well, join me today as I cut these films wide open, and try to understand the level of quality the 80s movies presented that gave them their own spark and made their stories leaving viewers on the edge of their seats, while Creepshow 3 leaves the audience wanting to watch another movie. Creepshow is first and foremost anthological stories that each all have their own setting, characters, and supernatural force that haunts the people in the tales. After all, the movies, or at least the first 2, are based off suspense horror comic books from the 1950s, so in order to create a likable movie under this genre, each story has to stand out and be its own thing. In order to do this, each story also has to make sure each of the 8 aforementioned elements feel different enough from one another to freshen things up and give each tale its own vibe and sense of horror. With the average Creepshow segment only lasting about 21 minutes, there's little room for certain long-term changes that make other stories great, such as character development. So anthological movies need to work with this aspect of making every story unique to keep the viewers tuned in and interested in the tales that are being sold. Well, that being said, the stories can still have similarities amongst each other to create a sort of flow, and these similarities also give Creepshow as a whole an identity. It's just these connections need to be implicit, or something that doesn't really stick out for the first watching, but becomes clear after you really think about these movies. The number one thing that runs through each of its stories is the fear of isolation, not being able to do anything to help one's situation, but each story is able to use its differences to paint this fear in its own way. So, in order to prove my point, I'm going to go through each of the stories, showcase each of their isolation aspect, and how it differentiates but connects each story, and also bring up some other things that make these tales good. Father's Day is about a few pretentious rich people at a mansion, with most of the characters being killed off one by the undead dad, which is then completely juxtaposed by the lonesome death of Jory Verrill, which is about a poor farmer on his own having to deal with the asteroid that keeps growing the moss around his small rundown house in the middle of nowhere. We're 2 stories deep, and already we see how my theory works. Despite the fact our characters, settings, and monsters are completely different, the narrative is still being driven, among other things, by the fact the characters are all alone and their interest by what's happening leads them to get killed. Let's move on to something to tide you over. While our previous stories served as complete opposites to each other, this narrative stands out by really shaking out the formula. First off, the character is on a private beach owned by Richard, and this character tortures our protagonist and his lover. So initially, our characters aren't being chased by an out-of-this-world monster. The first half is driven by Richard's evil plan, but since the first 2 stories showed us an abomination attack and kill the people on screen, the audience knows that somewhere down the line, another monster is going to show up and cause them harm. This build-up not only keeps the viewers waiting for Harry and Becky to return and get their revenge, but it also makes us root for them. So when they finally do come back and drown Richard, it serves as a satisfying ending and wrap things up adequately. The setting of the story works really well too because of its irony. Beaches are calming, peaceful places in the sun. People go there to kick back and relax, or have fun in the water with their friends and family. Yet in this story, our protagonist is facing the worst day of his life, as he's constantly being tortured and no one's there to save him. Now, let's move on to my favorite Creepshow story, The Crate. Like the previous story, The Crate has irony in its form of isolation. The prominent setting is a college campus, or should I say a college lab. But either way, colleges are known to be vibrant, lively places, with many people moving their feet around the area to get to their next class. But since the spring semester is done, and it's late at night, the property is practically empty. A college is also a place for people to learn and get educated, yet the characters die because they keep falling for the same mistakes. Speaking of which, no one would have died if the monster was left alone. In just about every horror movie, the monster chases the characters and kills them for some kind of motive. But the Yeti only kills because the people keep provoking it. I guess it's the old saying, curiosity killed the cat. Now, let's wrap up the first Creepshow with They're Creeping Up on You. This story is my least favorite out of this movie, mostly because I feel like a lot of the horror relies a little bit too much on the grossness of the cockroaches. But for what it's worth, it's not bad. The build-up is adequate. It really relies on the good old horror convention of, you know something's gonna happen, you just don't know when. The viewer knows sooner or later the roaches are going to conquer our villain, but how exactly will that happen, and when will it happen? I like the conflict Upson has with the Castameyers too. It works well with the tension of the ever-growing pest population, and it adds some sinisterism to the scene, a sort of supernatural feeling if you will. Oh, let's get to the isolation aspect. The isolation really works into the story for this one. After all, this character wants to stay as far away from people as possible. This person's need for isolation leads to their downfall, yet they were so dead set on being alone. Oh, I guess technically this isn't the last story. The voodoo doll is. And it's fine. I don't really have much to say about it considering it's very much unlike the movie's other stories. Alright, let's get on to Creepshow 2. Now, this film isn't as good as its predecessor. It only has 3 stories. None of them work as well as the previous tales, but for what they're worth, most of them are good. I was never a fan of The Hitchhiker, and each all have their own sense of isolation, so at least they got the first movie's strong suit right. Let's move things along with Chief Woodenhead. I quite like the setting for this story. It's a real small town near the mountains, so it's equal parts eerie and homey. It also provides some good looking cinematography. Speaking of which, let's talk about the isolation of this tale. Since it's a rather desolate area, there's only so many folk around. It's not like any of the others could have helped the hold-up prompted by Sam. Not to mention, the terrorizing happens at night, when everybody's probably asleep, or at their homes. So even if the couple tried to get help, how successful would their attempt been? Well, getting on to the other components of this narrative, one thing I like about this story is how it first shows off the statue. The viewer learns early on that Woodenhead is alive, and the film doesn't at all try to squash any suspicion of the chief's alive state, so it plays into it by showing how he moves ever so slightly. It acts as a little teaser to the audience to let them know, in due time, Woodenhead will do what needs to be done. Okay, let's move on to the raft. Like something that tied you over and the crate, I like the irony of the isolation of the scene. In most of these other stories, no matter how much the characters ran, the monster would still get them. They had to fight the monster in some way in order to subdue it. In this story, however, there's a definitive escape within their reach. All they had to do is reach land. But the raft monster is going to torture our young adults by keeping them at bay and on their toes. They can see a plethora of land where they'd be completely safe from this aqueous being. But yet, there they are, stuck on that small raft in that small body of water. And even when one of them does get onto land, it still isn't enough. Even though that part was completely predictable, I still like that it was included to show that nobody escapes from the raft monster. Okay, so this story is certainly my least favorite out of the bunch, and I think it's for 2 reasons. But before we get into that, I just want to bring up the isolation part. So, the story's isolation is kind of like the crates, in that both characters are in a place that would be filled with other people, but because they're at this location at a certain time, it's mostly empty. Okay, now my complaints. Number 1, it tries to be funny in a weird way. The way the hitchhiker constantly thanks the lady that is trying to kill him, and keeps coming back, is the writers trying to be funny. I think, because why else would he do that? I understand that Creepshow is supposed to be light horror, so it's not as hardcore as a slasher film, or any other type of horror movie that really shows off its kill scenes, and it doesn't try to frighten the audience too much. But in any case, I don't think this kind of comedy really works that well with this story, or Creepshow in general, a point that's proven with Creepshow 3 and the TV series. Maybe it's just me, but I don't think humor has ever really worked that well with Creepshow. There's just something about its vibes that I don't think really blends in that well with any of the other movies or the TV show. Now, I know the first movie also had a few moments of humor, but I think they fit in a lot better than any other pieces of comedy the series had. They point to the situation and characters, but even then, I still think it didn't work out that well. The second reason I'm not a fan of the story is that the sensory overload doesn't work well. So, when the hitchhiker latches onto the car, things go berserk with the driver swerving all over the road, screaming. Then the music gets all beat, and the cinematography is wacky to play into the unnerving feeling. Now, all this would have worked just fine, but it drags on for longer than it should be. Sensory overload only works if it's a rather short sequence. Otherwise, the viewer gets used to the overbearing stimulus, and it just isn't as uncomfortable as it should be. A movie needs to know when to pull the plug. That way the viewer not only has to process what just happened, but also calm down. Okay, I guess I should also mention the animated story in between. Like the voodoo doll, I don't really have much to say about it, considering how different it is from the rest of the movie, but it works fine. And since this movie didn't have much of the comic book stuff intertwined in the stories, I'd say this is a good substitute for the lack of said element. So, with all the stories out of the way, let's recap everything to put Creepshow's strong points in simpler words. Creepshow is far from being the first movie to use isolation as a main focus of fear, but the way it uses its isolation and changes it significantly throughout all of its stories not only gives it a unique identity, but also creates a flow throughout its tales. Of course, this wasn't the only thing that made the first 2 Creepshow movies good. One thing I liked about both films was the conflict of each narrative made sense, and played well with the settings, characters, and of course, isolation. Everything seemed to be built around each other. It doesn't feel like one aspect was chosen and then expanded upon. Not only does this help with the cohesiveness of the movie, but it adds to the tension of the scenes, which builds into the overall horror by making the story unnerving or uncomfortable. The characters had to live with themselves and the monster trying to kill them. I know I mentioned this in the intro, but nothing can beat those animatronics, the makeup, and prosthetics from the 80s movies. They're just so good looking, so detailed, and so creepy. They really tied the stories together with how realistic they look. So, with all the greatness that made the first two films good, it's time to let it all come down by analyzing the third movie. I wanted to talk about how Creepshow 3 fails in its predecessor standards and conventions in this section, rather than tearing it down after talking about the points I made prior, because I really wanted to highlight number 1, how bad this movie is, but number 2, how with some changes here and there, most of the stories could have been good and still fit in with Creepshow's feel and vibes. I feel like it would have been too much to digest if I just put them all together. So with all my previous points in mind, let's talk about Creepshow 3. Now, I do want to dig into each of these stories, but before I do that, I want to mention a few general things such as how each story is explicitly connected to each other in one way or another. They all take place in the same city, and certain characters, locations, and plot points appear again and again. Now, you think I may be completely against that because my point of uniqueness is key, but I think with the right execution, having these explicit connections could work, but the way this movie does it isn't adequate, mostly because some of the settings are too similar to each other. Half of Alice takes place on a suburban street, and the other half in a suburban home. The voice takes place mostly in an apartment complex. Call Girl takes place mostly in a suburban home. The professor's wife takes place in a suburban home. And Haunted Dog is split between the streets, the doctor's home, this weird cult place, and the doctor's office. So, as you can see, 3 of these stories take place in pretty much the same environment. Or in other words, 60% of the movie is in a suburban setting. The suburban setting isn't the problem. It's the fact it's used over and over again. Something the first 2 movies didn't do. Each story had its own unique location, and used that to build into its sense of isolation and explain the characters' different conflicts. I feel like this concept could have worked better if instead of each story taking place in the same city, each story could take place in the same state or country. Certain states in the US and certain countries have all kinds of different terrain that determine the type of infrastructure, or lack thereof, that accompanies it. Like, I think New York could be a good state to use. You could have a story take place in a skyscraper, one could take place on the streets, one could take place in the suburbs, one could take place in the countryside, one could take place in an apartment complex, and so on and so on. You can make all these connect in their own ways too, like the characters in one story are close friends with the characters in another tale, the events of one story could directly affect the situation of another story, or maybe a story ends and the camera pans to the next location without having to cut to another scene. Moving on, I also want to praise this movie for not using CGI, or at least not a lot of it. All the supernatural things are handmade and practical. This movie wasn't made by a big studio, so they could have easily cheaped out and used CGI instead, but they stuck to Creepshow's guns and kept everything practical, so props to them. There's one more thing I want to talk about for this movie before we dive into the individual stories, and that is the animated segment. I absolutely love this short piece of the film. It fits in perfectly with the animation of the time, and in my opinion, it still holds up today not only how it looks, but with its content. It works well with the animated content of the time and nowadays. Alright, that's enough of the general stuff. Let's get the shrapnel to each of these individual stories, starting with Alice. Alice is a story about a stuck-up teenage girl that's rather rude to other people. When she arrives home one day, her family is in the living room, while her dad fiddles with the TV remote. But as soon as he hits any button, Alice is transported outside of her house. Alice goes back inside to see her family is completely different, but the same thing happens. Dad hits the button, and she's back outside. This keeps happening, and along with the teleportation, Alice's skin becomes more and more mangled and icky, to the point where her family sees her and is freaked out. Alice runs outside of her house, only for her to turn into a bunny, and the professor of the town picks her up and explains he's the one that did it. Alice was an ugly soul, so this is what she deserved. Alright, if I'm being honest, the story isn't too bad. It's kinda quick and isn't that deep, but for what it's worth, the premise isn't bad. It's easy to follow. The prosthetics put on Alice look realistic and icky, and has some sort of reason and meaningful conclusion. Despite the fact Alice isn't the kind of soul, I still feel bad for her. I'm not exactly sure anybody deserved her fate, let alone just a bratty teenager. It serves as a good introduction too, at least on the framework for some of the characters, settings, and situations viewers will see in the rest of the movie. I will say too, the sensory overload the last 2 minutes gives works too, and is unsettling because the screaming from the family and Alice, their father going to find his gun, and Alice running for her life all build into the tension of the moment. And as I said before, I felt bad for Alice, so I didn't want her to die. But I guess in the end she was saved, or should I say under new management. Well, the next story, The Voice, isn't so bad either. It's about a security guard named Jerry that lives in a rundown apartment and wants a better life. One day after buying a used radio, a mysterious voice comes through and instructs our protagonist on how to actually improve his life and make significant changes. Most of the scenes aren't exactly moral though, such as Jerry having to kill his neighbor and stealing a bunch of money. When Jerry is instructed to leave the complex by the radio, it turns out two of the other characters also had the same voice coming through a radio they owned, and they kill each other. I don't like this one as much as Alice, but it does have some quality to it, and is somewhat of an enthralling tale. The suspense and build-up of the story are actually good. The mystery of the voice drives this narrative in an interesting way, because the viewer starts to question the truthfulness of the voice. But after Mike does each action, it seems to prove its word every time. But even then, it's still hard to trust it because of the evil stuff the voice instructs our protagonist to do. The pacing and cinematography of the story is well done too. It gives the viewer just enough to keep their attention, but also thrill them with the tension of each situation. The only thing I don't like is the ending. It all happens so fast, and it's not like it explains exactly what happened, or why the voice helped the pimp in this scenario. It kinda makes the whole story seem like there's little rhyme or reason for the events. It would have been nice if just a little bit of background was given to the voice, or the pimp character. Well, with our decent stories out of the way, it's all downhill from here, so let's move on to the call girl. Victor is looking to pay a woman to be rather intimate with him, and so he calls up a prostitute to do business. Once the woman Rachel arrives, the two talk a little bit and go to the bedroom. After some empty romance, Rachel kills Victor and washes off the blood in the bathroom. While cleaning up, she hears Victor is still making noise, so she goes back to see if she needs to put her victim closer to death, but turns out this guy's a vampire of some sorts and kills her. Well, to be blunt, the story is bland and empty. There's just nothing to it really. The conflict is shallow, it comes and goes with seemingly no rhyme or reason, and I don't care for either of the characters because there's nothing to like about them. The prosthetics they give to Victor isn't too bad, it does look fairly unsettling, but it seems the story was made to either fill time or add some gore to the movie. Remember how I talked about how most of the narratives in the first two films felt carefully crafted, and that each had their own unique setting and conflict that played with its isolation? Well, that's this movie's biggest problem. From this story onwards, it feels like the writers kinda just came up with ideas that could have worked, but only so much was considered in terms of how the story should go, and each of its aspects were only given so much thought. Not to mention, some of the settings aren't exactly away from the other people. Most of these characters could have gotten help in their predicaments, so it really doesn't play in the Creepshow identity by taking away its biggest aspect, the isolation. Okay, let's continue the dullness with the professor's wife. Remember the professor from Alice? Well, as I mentioned before, he's an absolute genius, and has finally met his other half, and is gonna get married. As such, he wants to invite two of his favorite students to meet his partner. When they arrive, they notice something's off about the professor's wife. She seems robotic, almost like she's not human, which gets the boys thinking, is she actually a human being, or a creation by the professor? After all, he's known to be a prankster, so once the boys are convinced she's not a human, they perform an extensive autopsy on her, but after finding out her parts are 100% organic, they leave before the professor comes back. This is written as a comedy story, and that's my main issue with this one. I already mentioned how I don't think Creepshow and comedy mix well because it confuses the audience, and this is a prime example. The previous three stories were fairly serious stories. There were no jokes, and each tale tried to invoke a feeling of fear, and now we have a story that tries to be funny and really throws off the tone and mood of this movie. Not to mention, the jokes are really stupid and have no comedic merit whatsoever. The execution sucks. They're so bland and dumb. I don't know how anybody thought this was funny. You know, I feel like this could have been decent by making a few modifications. First of all, cut the comedy. I think I made that point clear already. Secondly, I think it could have been fairly creepy if the stories about how the professor dug up the remains of someone he loved, or obsessed over if you want to go there, added some robotic parts here and there to explain her less than human expressions, and when the boys cut her open, they found out the dark truth. This could have raised a great moral dilemma. Was the wife human enough to be considered human? The person was already dead, so it doesn't matter if they were killed the second time? See? I just fixed the story, and it took me like less than 5 minutes to think and write that up. Alright, there's only one more left. Let's end this drag with Haunted Dog. The narrative follows this pathetic excuse for a human, Dr. Farewell, that acts like everybody's beneath him. He treats nobody with respect, quite frankly, is just an asshole. One day, he drops a hot dog which is then tainted by the ground, and gives it to a homeless man asking for food, and as the individual chomps down on the delicacy, he chokes and dies. For the rest of the story, the doctor is shown doing his normal everyday activities, but he's often haunted by the ghost of that man. At the end, he gets cornered by the ghost, only for the spirit to thank him. Trust me, that joke is as unfunny as you think it is. So, to reinstate one of my previous points, the jokes aren't funny. Their setups are uninspired, and the execution is boring and predictable. There's nothing new, or even remotely comedic. Secondly, the way the story unfolds is confusing. I don't understand why the doctor doing all kinds of stuff is shown. It doesn't meld into the horror or comedy, so I don't know what the point of some of these scenes are. They really should have focused on how the doctor is coping with the fact he killed somebody. It could have shown that even the coldest of people can still have some kind of heart, and how guilt is one strong force no matter how bad a person is. But instead, we get build up for a joke that's not funny in any way, shape, or form. Not to mention, I had no idea who I'm supposed to root for in this story. You want to know what was great about Something to Tide You Over in Chief Woodenhead? The audience knew the bad guys in those tales were going to get what they deserved by the supernatural force. So, not only did that keep viewers watching, but when the evildoers were killed, it felt nice knowing the innocent characters were avenged. Some justice was served. The viewer had someone to root for. They knew the villain wouldn't get away with their evil. The story does no such thing. The Doctor is an absolute jerk, and no other character is given a personality in this tale. So, what exactly is the audience going to look forward to when watching this? It's a mess with no complexity, and no reason. So, let's go over everything one more time to really emphasize the genius of the first two films and the shortcomings of the third movie. The first two movies all have their own unique settings, characters, situations, and monsters, and every aspect played into one another, which is great for anthologies, because each story has to be unique and be different enough from one another to succeed within this genre. Most of the ideas for Creepshow 3 feel half-baked, as if one of the writers had a decent idea for a story, but only had so much ambition in making it a memorable part of the movie. The isolation aspect of the 80s movies not only gave Creepshow an identity, but made each story spooky and kept the flow throughout the flick. There's only so much of this aspect in the third movie, and as such, it really doesn't justify being called Creepshow 3. Not to mention, Creepshow 1 and 2 had likable characters, unforgettable monsters, and tense situations to keep the viewers interested in the stories, but creeped out by the madness happening on screen. Most of Creepshow 3's characters aren't well written, or have much of a personality, and most of the conflicts weren't really that interesting or encapsulating. Also, the third movie's humor just sucks. There's nothing more to say about it. Honestly, Creepshow 3 could have been a lot better if they cut out the comedy, and made the rest of the stories like Alice and the Radio. Those two narratives are decent, they could have used more development, but otherwise, they kept me entertained the whole way through. There's some quality ideas and execution in both of them. Honestly, the third movie really should have used more real creepy monsters. After all, the first two movies showed the audience some ghastly beings, and they not only added a lot to the horror aspect, but they gave the film and the individual stories character. They looked cool, and all had their own look and identity. The third movie doesn't really have any monsters apart from Victor, so again, Creepshow 3 has no right calling itself a Creepshow film when it fails in the most basic aspects of its predecessors. Well, with all that out of the way, that's all I have to say about the Creepshow movies. I think one day I'll talk about the TV show, because for the most part, I do enjoy it, and there's supposedly a Creepshow game that's supposed to release sooner or later, so maybe I'll talk about it when that drops. Other than that, have a good day, kitties.